Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the brand new album from Swans, titled To Be Kind. Now there are certain rock bands that if you mention them in polite conversation, you will have pegged yourself immediately as a hardcore music nerd. Bands that critics love but who have never scored a hit on any chart of which you ever heard of. Or, maybe just that one song, but it's a song that fans will swear isn't representative of the band whatsoever. Bands that have vast discographies of albums that critics and hardcore fans will rave about for hours, while everyone else in the room just shrugs and goes back to their beer. And as a newer critic who's always hunting for more music, it's been a difficult and yet vastly rewarding challenge to go through some of these discographies and going through my backlog. Hell, I wish I had more time to do it more. Last year for me was Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and to tell you what, Push the Sky Away ended up being on my list of the favorite albums of that last year. Hell, it was my favorite album of last year. And this year the challenge looked even greater, as I was now tackling a band with a frankly monstrous reputation in a genre that up until a few years ago, I wouldn't have even called this music. The band was called Swans, originating in the early 80s as an act in the no-wave scene, less focused on cohesive melodies and lyrical songs than crushing percussion, musical texture, and guttural phrases repeated into a mantra. It was musical philosophy that flew in the face of everything of what I liked and considered was music, and yet by the time I got to Children of God, they had won me over wholesale. Perhaps it was the moment they opted for a slightly more melodic approach, but Swans' brand of punishing viscera, it was effective beyond that, primal, emotionally gripping, and genuinely unsettling, but also nuanced and beautiful. And outside of a brief moment on a major label with The Burning World, which honestly wasn't that terrible, some of the most inspired compositions that I had heard in a long time, with the biggest highlights for me being the thought-provoking Children of God and the damn near inspired album The Great Annihilator. And thus, I can only imagine how it felt for Swans fans in the late 90s when the band broke up after Soundtracks for the Blind. And yet in 2010, the band reformed miraculously with a new lineup and released the album My Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope to the Sky, which was decent. It was good at return, but not quite up to their standards of the truly amazing material. Just feeling a little bit underweight for me. Thankfully, Swans kicked things into harsher gears with The Seer, which was a great album in 2012, and now they're back with their newest record, To Be Kind, which is so far one of the most critically acclaimed albums of this year. So with all that in mind, how'd it go? Well, this is going to be a tough one because of all of the albums that I've listened through thus far this year, To Be Kind by Swans is one that really resists easy analysis and categorization. Not just because it feels like a culmination of Swans' entire eclectic career up to this point and fused into a massively cacophonous, gleefully profane, and altogether terrifying soundscape, it's also revealing of so many inherent contradictions in the music that this album just becomes impossible to put much of a label on it. And thus, even with the factor that this album is amazing and easily one of Swans' best releases period, it's also a record that I'm in no position to recommend to anyone in the mainstream. Because how can you approach this without the full context of the other records? How can you articulate such methodical madness? An album hell-bent on primal ecstasy and making it sound so compelling and yet so very deeply terrifying. Well, in a very deeply twisted and yet familiar way, Michael Gira did it in the same way that he always does. He infuses the music with a very relatable human element. He makes it feel relatable, sinking into blackened blues rock that could be considered conventionally accessible, and swaggering, perfectly articulated grooves to feed into the frenzy and continuously keep the balance askew. On tracks like Oxygen and a Little God in My Hands, Gira sounds more unhinged than he ever has, spitting and spraying with a visceral style that I haven't heard from him since the no-wave era in the mid-80s. And the way he howls commands on the 34-minute epic-long song Bring Up the Sun, Toussaint L'Ouverture makes him sound like he's on a battlefield. And placed opposite that are songs where he's a little bit more familiar, measured, grimy cadence comes through. It almost sounds like recitations of a cult leader, with the female backing vocals of St. Vincent, Al Spix, and Lil Annie falling in behind him to create that demonic choir. And make no mistake here, the contrast is jarring, but that's the point. The uneasy and ever-shifting balance between order and anarchy, driven home time and time again by the instrumentation. The rhythmic, bluesy riffs anchored by meaty guitars or tightly regimented keyboards eventually build up into titanic crescendos that send every sound screaming and ricocheting off each other in a cacophony of distortion and noise, and yet somehow The production is so good that it all feels cohesive. The percussion in particular has its own brand of thunder, and yet there are moments where it becomes more and more brittle with every strike before breaking altogether. And that's contrasted over some songs that are just hazy soundscapes, all mood and soft focus, but nevertheless have their own hidden structure. And songs that seem to be all demented energy for crystallizing to a shape that was there all along. You just couldn't see it. And there are so many instrumental moments strewn throughout this album that deserve acclaim for their variety in color and production on nearly every single track. The picked bass riffs, spiky guitar riffs, and off-kilter piano and screenshot, the mocking laughter and Just a Little Boy at Jira's squawking calls, the hollow drums and tight groove of A Little God in My Hands, the jittery guitar bouncing off some of the unstable string section in Some Things We Do, the killer riffs, a slow acoustic strum, fluttery synth line, and the rumbling bass drum waves and She Loves Us, the roiling percussion and echoing bells and Kirsten Supine, the insane horns and Oxygen, the sampled digressions, beautiful transition into the guitars and Natalie Neal, and how the dark nursery rhyme tone of the title track builds to the most crushing moment of the entire album. It's insane. That's not even talking about the Bring Up the Sun Tucson Louverture and all of the moments on that track alone. The sudden opening burst of sizzling guitar that catches you by surprise, that somehow only gets harsher as the song goes on. The marching beat of the drums that comes in around the 8-minute mark that builds it to a wave-like cadence that I really liked. The galloping horse sample, the sleigh bells, and the eerie synth line coming in around the 22-minute mark that all come together to create a song that's damn near cinematic. Now, some of you are immediately saying, and you're going to make the argument that all this instrumentation that I just described, it's indulgent and it's over the top. And combined with the fact that the majority of songs on this album are well over 7 minutes, it's an argument with a significant amount of evidence behind it. And even though Jira is the master of the slow building crescendo and building ambient atmosphere and somehow managing to somehow keep new things happening throughout every single minute of these songs, even if it's subtle, even little changes, there are moments where I will admit that this album could have been trimmed back just a little bit. Even some of the better grooves begin to lose some of their staying power if they overextend their welcome. And yeah, I'll admit, there are noisier segments on this album that even with my fondness for some of the grooves, they can get a little bit hard to handle, even for me. But you know what? This all circles back to the big question: lyrics and themes, and what this monstrosity of an album is actually trying to say with all this. Because at first glance, it's an album that seems to play in very much of the same realm as Swans' earlier work, exposing human nature on its most primal level and every base and bestial thing about it. And when viewed outside of context, very few of the lyrics even pretend to make sense or tell any sort of a cohesive story. They sound like words that be screamed like the baby on the cover of this album, overloaded with profanity and without any real knowledge of what that profanity means. And you know what? For a while, I gotta admit, I really struggled with what this album meant on any sort of thematic level, if anything at all. But then I read an interview where Michael Gear seemed annoyed that people considered his music depressing. To quote him directly, "My goal is ecstasy." That, combined with the odd focus on words talking about love and passion and motherhood and kindness on this record, finally clicked for me. My interpretation of To Be Kind, which is just one interpretation, my own, is that of an album exploring a very young child's view of the surrounding world. The album embraces maximalism because at that very basic level of a young kid's mind, that's all the child can articulate and understand. The words spoken, they hold power, but the child doesn't understand what that power is or where it actually comes from in those words. The child has no comprehension of any sort of consequences, so he simply does things, just almost abrasively, almost out of nowhere. When the child sees a war on a song like Bring Up the Sun, Toussaint Louverture, he sees a conflict of such epic scale that he can't understand it beyond just words echoing over the battlefield that become hollow and lose their meaning. That's the reason why the name Natalie is used on the track Natalie Neal, because it's a name that means nativity, meaning birth. Imagery that is evoked multiple times throughout the course of this record. In short, Jira seems fixed on capturing the sense of being in that sensory overload, of being so young that everything around you seems so huge and epic. And in this regard, he does an incredible job capturing that wondrous force, even if at points it proves to be a little terrifying or just overwhelming to hear, but then again, that's all part of his point. So here's the follow-up question. What is Michael Gira aiming to say at the end of this record with To Be Kind? His goal might be ecstasy, his protagonist might desire love, but this album seemed designed to take that earnest aspiration and obliterate it utterly with mocking laughter. And yet, at the end of this album, I get the funny feeling that Gira managed to find that moment of primal ecstasy that comes in simple kindness. And though it starts quietly, it has the power to crush everything in its path through its sheer awesome might. Kind of cosmic and out there of interpretation, I admit that. But considering how many times that Swans have written extensively about the awe-inspiring power of the divine, even the little things, I'm not denying that it might be a valid interpretation. So in the end, on a purely aesthetic note, this album is goddamn incredible. The production is flawless, the vocals are visceral, the instrumentation is ridiculously complex and yet very simply and effectively powerful, and yet all of it is overloaded with more emotional power than most bands could ever hope to bring to the table. I won't quite say it's perfect, or that it's my favorite Swans album. Children of God and The Great Annihilator, they stand pretty tall, at least in my books. And I can't help but feel that a bit of a tighter edit on this record might have helped this album play a little bit better for me. But you know what? It's damn good, and one of the best and most thought-provoking albums of this year. Easily a 9 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation. But let me stress that you might want to look at other Swans records before checking this out first. This album is intentionally overwhelming, and yeah, it's also well over 2 hours, and you'll want to pay attention for every single detail. But honestly, it's not a record that the average pop listener will be able to take in on the first or even the second or even the 10th listen. One of the reasons this review took so long to get out. Either way, you should all make time to check out To Be Kind by Swans. You're not going to hear a record like this in a long time, and it really is something special. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Bit of a longer review, but when an album is this complex, it deserves it. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out this year that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.